Alrighty, good morning, good morning. So, all right, we'll get started here in a sec, and I don't know, mostly people have just been asking questions by talking, but if anyone wants to still use the Slido, all good there. Before I get started though, midterm, I will say I have not started marking it yet, obviously. It's probably going to be next week before I get it marked. I just am backed up on marking, especially for SOS 315. I have a bunch of stuff that I need to do first because it's been sitting now for a week and a half, almost 2 weeks. And it's like partially done. So this is like third in line for marking. So I will get it done as soon as I can. And I will ruin all of your reading weeks by officially posting a grade during reading week. I'm really sorry. I would prefer not to, but I'd prefer to get it done this week. But I probably won't get it done until next week. Did everybody feel okay about the midterm? Did I surprise you with anything? Was it all very shocking or very exactly what I said it was going to be? Okay, good. Try to be fair. All right, so my mic is dead, so I have to try and stand in front of my laptop or the sound won't carry through, and not pacing around the room is incredibly difficult for me because it's such a habit. Also, I have a rock in my shoe, which is super unpleasant. There we go. All right. So. All right. So we're going to kind of do our last little bit of sort of more historical sociology here. We've taken up till past midterm 2 to get through theories, concepts, and then into some stuff that's a little bit more contemporary. So we're going to treat this sort of as a bridge. I always mean to have this before the second midterm and never make it because everything else is so interesting. So we're kind of leaving behind some of that historical stuff and the foundations, and we're going to look at now some more topical stuff right after doing this, right? So this is another and our last, I promise, Rodney Stark based subject, which is the Churching of America. Again, sort of looking at some historical sociology and what has happened in kind of America to kind of lead it to where it was. Following this, I guess not next week, but the week after, we're going to step into, and I think I'm going to switch it up a little bit from what I have on the syllabus, which I think I had youth and religion next, and I think I'm going to switch it to religious landscape, because I can never figure out with these next few topics which one to do first, because they all kind of flow into each other, but then what order to do them in, I actually don't know. So last year I did youth and religion, then landscape, then the nuns, and this year I'm doing religious landscape, and then I don't know. I might be youth and then nuns, or nuns and then youth. I can't figure it out because they all kind of flow together, and there's no right way to do it. But religious landscape is next up on the agenda. So this should take us about 2 classes, I think. We should be done, so it's relatively short. Okay, so I promise. Like I said, I promise this is our very last entire Rodney Stark based kind of argument. So this is kind of another book that Stark put out. They originally put this out in Roger Fink and Rodney Stark, and Fink is more of an economist than he is a sociologist, but that's the kind of people that Rodney likes to run around with. He doesn't think much of a lot of sociologists, I guess. Shock. So this book basically tried to do, in a sense, what the rise of Christianity did in reconstructing kind of historically a bunch of sociological data that we maybe don't have really great statistics for, but trying to figure out what did America look like in terms of its religiosity. Is it, this kind of story that we have of, the Pilgrims, they were super religious. So, America has always been a deeply religious nation. And now it's going through this period of modernization followed by secularization. Or is it something else, right? Stark, because he's Stark, is always attacking just everyone like a honey badger. He is the honey badger of sociology. But he's attacking, again, secularization thesis in particular. And yeah, I mean, really, you can see from the subtitle, so basically the Church of America, 1776 to 2005, winners and losers in our religious economy, right? So again, this kind of market theory oriented kind of view of sociology of religion. And yeah, I mean, basically trying to reconstruct how America became, or how the American religious landscape developed between 1776 and 2005. Okay, so here again, I think we encounter a sort of version of Stark's myth of past piety argument, right? That basically, right, we have this received wisdom, right, this kind of narrative, and you've probably seen it on American TV, right, the Thanksgiving story, and the Pilgrims left England to escape religious persecution. They set up in Plymouth Rock, and since then, America has been super duper religious. Forever and ever until recently, right? And basically what Stark and Fink say is that this notion is basically fundamentally incorrect, essentially from the beginning. It is a myth, right? It's a myth that serves particular purposes, but it is a myth nonetheless. So they suggest, right, that in 1776, so that's the year of the American Revolution, only about 17% of Americans were churched. Right? By which they mean they belong to a particular church congregation. And then it's basically a sort of nostalgia with regards to, say, the Pilgrims, who arrived in the U.S. circa around 1620, that they were hyper-religious, and so America itself has always been this deeply religious nation. Now, it's not necessarily completely untrue, but one of the things that sorry, I should go back one slide here. One of the things that Stark and Fink note is ultimately that while this original generation of, say, the Pilgrims were in fact religious fundamentalists, right? They were a hyper-religious group that set up shop. What we see is that, one generation later, and certainly two generations later, a lot of that religious energy had kind of dissipated, right? That basically the children of the Pilgrims and the grandchildren of the Pilgrims were far less religious than their grandparents and grandparents had been, right? Once that, kind of, you can think of it maybe here in like status discontent or sheltered enclave theory kind of terms, right? Once that external pressure from, say, religious oppression by the Church of England in Britain had sort of faded away and they moved to the colonies. Once that kind of external pressure that kept them tightly bound and very religious sort of dissipated in the new place, ultimately their religiosity started to spread out. The other thing, and this is something that Stark and Fink will make note of at several points in the book, is that America is this wide open frontier, right? It is basically untamed wilderness for the most part. You're always kind of on the frontier. And that a lot of the people that get attracted to this kind of place, right, to the frontier where the law enforcement and kind of social structures are very weak, tend to be, people who are risk takers, especially men, and, the kind of person who isn't fundamentally very religious. And so as the country moves outward, right, west further and further, this frontier moves further and further, but you always have this same kind of dynamic, right? The Wild West is a fundamentally kind of irreligious place in a lot of ways because it attracts sort of irreligious risk-taking men for the most part. And this period of like the colonies, in a sense, is no different, right? It attracted a lot of people who were looking for opportunities, who were risk-takers, and who weren't especially concerned about religious questions, right? Because they are, kind of young, ambitious, men who just want a place where there's not a lot of social structure. Okay. Now, a little bit later, right? Once we get into the 19th century, the American religious landscape has changed fundamentally, right? So past, 1776, there's already kind of major differences with, say, Europe that Stark and Fink really want to point out. And one of these, okay, so basically where Stark is going to take a lot of this information is from European scholars who visited the United States and noted its kind of particular religious character and noted it as being fundamentally different than Europe. Now, again, this is in furtherance of Stark's point, right, in The Triumph of Faith and Secularization, R.I.P., that basically Europe was never all that religious, right? That there's this weird kind of state support that makes religion kind of lethargic in Europe. And here, Stark sort of revisits this point and finds evidence in it in these visiting European scholars, right? So basically, visiting, the United States in the beginning of the 19th century, the French scholar Alexis de Tocqueville, noted, in this very famous book, Democracy in America. And this is something that inevitably, I think, political conservatives like to cite a lot in terms of, the religious character of the United States. But what does Tocqueville note? That its religious character had developed in a way that made it very distinct from Europe, right? That it was, it had a very unusual religious character. And so, Tocqueville is French, right? And he's coming to the United States, just a few decades after the French Revolution, right? And so, the French Revolution is 1789, I think, 1788, 1789. So just a few decades later. But already, right, there's differences between the American religious landscape and his native France and other places he's been in Europe. Right, so the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck his attention, right? And de Tocqueville notes the religious character of the United States as being tremendously important to its form of democracy, right? Okay. So other European scholars, very famously, Francis Grund, the Austrian, Andrew Reid from England, Philip Schaff from Germany, and probably most familiar to most of you, because you've been hearing about him since SOS 100, is the esteemed Max Weber, the writer of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And Weber and all these other folks all visited the United States, right? And one of the things that was noted, particularly by Weber, but all of them, so they were accustomed, right, to this situation where in Europe, fundamentally, state and church were deeply connected, right? And the kings and the state had been funding the religious lives of those churches for a long time. In Germany, there were two established churches. There was the Catholic Church and the Evangelical Church, by which we mean Lutherans. And basically, what Weber, Reid, Grund, and Schaff noted was that the United States was kind of weird, right? Already after 1776, it had developed this sort of, this, because it's in the Constitution, this separation of church and state, right? Where the federal government didn't officially establish a state church. And this ultimately brings with it some kind of weird realities, right? If churches are going to survive, in that American frontier and in those colonies, they need support from somewhere, right? It costs money to run churches, to upkeep buildings, to pay clergy. It might not cost much, but they do need to be supported in some ways. And if churches are going to offer services to people, if they're going to run hospitals, schools, the social welfare system, right, that money has to come from somewhere. So, yeah, the Europeans were accustomed to churches getting support from the state, and they were surprised that these churches could maintain membership when people had to actively support churches out of their own pocket, right? They assumed, right, that if people, say in Germany, and this is famously kind of what Weber says, if people in Germany had to pay out of pocket for church, they would have stopped going, right? Because they weren't interested, and that's not the cultural mindset that had developed in Europe. The church was funded by the state since Constantine. Okay, so Weber, right? The church affiliation in the USA brings with it incomparably higher financial burdens, especially to the poor, than anywhere in Germany, right? And he gives the example of a congregation in Lake Erie where German lumberjacks, right, paid approximately $80 of their $1,000 a year salary to support the church, right? So nearly 10% of their total salaries went to the church. And everyone knows that even a small fraction of this financial burden in Germany would lead to a mass exodus from the church. So already the US is really different culturally, right? There are churches, they're thriving, and they're getting donations from people in a way that Europeans would never be willing to do, right? Because their culture had supported this kind of state control and state funding of churches. All right. Oh, I knew this was on a slide somewhere. I just got ahead of myself. Right. So yeah, this is Stark and Fink basically tell us the image of the Pilgrims as these hyper-religious, and linking, that to an image of America causes a few problems, right? It ignores the kind of open frontiers kind of way that the U.S. was at its founding, right? And well into a few centuries later, right? The U.S. and its kind of expansion westward remains very, very untamed. It remains, a frontier kind of society into, the point where it kind of hits California at the end of the day. And yeah, I mean, basically, this results in high levels of social deviance, crime, prostitution, alcohol abuse, and low levels of church involvement, right? If you've ever seen a Western, right, like a Western movie, and they're not super popular anymore, but I grew up on them because my dad loved Westerns and he's old. He grew up in the 40s, or I guess he grew up mostly in the 50s and 60s, and they were very popular then. But right, the picture of the Wild West town, on the frontier is one where there's gambling, prostitution, everybody's drinking whiskey at the saloon, right? There's a lot of train robbers and bandits kind of roaming around. And this is a relatively, we know there's very famous stories of, these bandits on the American frontier. What is it? Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and the like, right? And these are just a few of them. It was a place of, enormous kind of contention. And yeah, this tends to lead to low social cohesion and very little religion. So the image of kind of early America is exactly that. And even the Puritan settlements in New England, which had high levels of involvement initially, by the mid-1600s, there were signs of religious apathy and dissent. People complaining, that the kids aren't all right, essentially. Subsequent generations of immigrants to New England were less religiously enthusiastic than initial migrants. And again, a lot of this migration is coming from, places in Europe, especially England, that aren't particularly religious in the way, kind of Weber's describing. Okay. So this is the chart of church membership that Fink and Stark kind of reconstruct with a whole bunch of religious data, right? And again, all of this is kind of in these different papers, right, that they kind of pull from. But essentially, they're drawing a bunch of historical data. They go around and they pull out of archives. Because, one of the things that some of these, especially older established churches did was they kept membership registries for a really long time. And so a lot of these are in archives. So Stark and Fink, probably not them, probably their army of graduate students, went into these, this is what graduate students are for, going to find dusty things and looking at them and then telling you as the researcher, and then you get to publish it. And they get to be like, I worked on that project. I sucked dust in the archive for 6 months. The life of a grad student. In case you're thinking of graduate school and you want to do history or something, have fun doing archival work. Dusty. But right, basically they went in, they got all these church records, right, from the past, from the big denominations in New England and other places, and as it expanded out, they gathered like decades and centuries of kind of church membership data. And then, once the Census Bureau of the U.S. gets established and they start asking religious questions, then you have census data, but that's not till relatively late. They kind of reconstruct this chart of church membership, and right, they start out at 1776, where about 17%, they say, of people in the U.S. were attached to a religious congregation. And that shouldn't be necessarily all that confounding. Like, if you think of the founding fathers of the U.S., right, in a lot of ways, folks like Jefferson, Adams, Washington, right, they were Enlightenment kind of people, and they were less religious in a lot of ways. Like, I think they respected religion in some ways, but a lot of them were kind of leery of it as well. Right, certainly Jefferson, who famously took a penknife to the Bible and cut out all the supernatural aspects of it to end up with a much, much shorter book at the end of the day once you took out all the supernatural stuff. Anyway, right, so what they reconstruct is you get, a kind of growth in church membership, so that about, middle of the 19th century, so this is sort of where our census begins, actually 1860, I think, you get, about a third of Americans belonging to a church congregation. It dips a little bit after the Civil War, right? So the Civil War is right in this period. It dips a little bit, but then it rises kind of inexorably through the 20th century until about 2000, where it's at essentially its highest point, right? That more Americans in 2000 are attached to church than ever before. Okay. Do I have this on the next slide? I can't even remember. I know this material, so I'm just I don't even have to look at it. Okay. Sorry, I had my narrations here, right? Again, one of the things that Stark, Fundament, and Fink, but I'm going to say Fink's just along for the ride, because it's my buddy, Rodney. May he rest in peace. One of the things that fundamentally Stark is after here is, again, this notion of, is modernity toxic to religion, right? Because in 1776, the U.S. is not modern, right? It's not a modern nation because modernity hasn't hit yet. Now, by the time we hit 1850, now the U.S. has gone, through the Industrial Revolution, right? Especially in the North, right? It's industrialized, it's urbanizing, it's going through all of those things that were happening in Europe. And it only gets more modern fundamentally from there, right? It only gets, modernity gets more modern, if you will. That's a terrible way of describing it. I'm sorry. But we move through modernity, right? And modernity gets a bigger and bigger hold on people through this period. And yet, if they're right, as modernity goes, religion actually grows, right? You're actually seeing more religiosity. Now, it may very well be, the social dislocation caused by the transformation from basically a pre-modern society to a modern society pushes people into religion. That would be a sort of Marxist deprivation theory type argument. But, fundamentally, the trend that they're identifying is one that's basically, it's upward, right? It's going up. As modernity unfolds, society's getting more religious, not less. So again, we're aiming here at, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, secularization thesis, Steve Bruce, even late secularization, right? Because middle part of the 20th century, it's pretty religious, but it gets even more religious by 2005, right? So we're still kind of moving in a positive direction. All right. So using this data, right, they argue that this thesis that modernity and religion are incompatible, it doesn't make any sense, right? Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But it wouldn't be modernity for Stark and Fink that maybe drives religion down in a place like Europe. It's something else, right? It's not modernity, it's some other social force, right? Whether it is that deep tie of state and religion, which kind of sapped religion of its vitality. In America, you get something very different, right? So I'm going to circle this. Religion in America has continued to grow and thrive despite modernity, right? And post-modernity. Now, we'll look at the religious landscape here and we'll see that after 2005, things do shift a little bit in a sort of negative direction. So maybe it does make sense to put religious landscape right after this so you get an update on what's going on. But fundamentally, as America modernized, it seems to have gotten more religious. Okay. So what makes America different? And again, we're going back to market theory here. So I could have put this in the middle of the theories. Maybe I should have. But what makes America different? De Tocqueville, the main reason for the quiet sway of religion over their country was the complete separation of church and state. And I think, this is an incredibly counterintuitive statement. Because I think the assumption that we would have, right, is that religion would be more influential if it's supported by the state, right? This has always been the thesis of, say, those who think that Constantine is the reason that Christianity ultimately became powerful in Europe, right? That it was state support. But what de Tocqueville is kind of saying. And again, it's so counterintuitive, which is why I think it's interesting. I know I love Stark for being so counterintuitive all the time. It's this separation of church and state that actually makes it more important and more powerful in that society. Because, and we'll see why Stark thinks, again, it's all back to market theory, there has to be innovation, right? Religion can't sit on its laurels. Okay, and Philip Schaff, right, 1855, so 2 decades after de Tocqueville, the United States are by far the most religious and Christian country in the world because religion there is the most free, right? So again, this is a big basis for Stark talking about building this kind of market theory. And right, Congress shall make no, this is the First Amendment of the Constitution. It's based on this. Oops, I shouldn't have crossed that out. I'm sorry. That Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? So the federal government is not going to establish a religion or stop the free exercise thereof, which leaves that space wide open. Okay, and Fink and Stark argue that it's the deregulated nature that leads to its success. Okay. So how does this work in principle? And I'm like, I really should have talked about this when we talked about market theory. Maybe it would have made more sense. Well, it's hard to fit some of these things in sometimes. Okay, so by the middle of the 18th century, right? So the 1700s, right? 18th century, 1700s, right? The diversity of settlers and their religious, or their religions created a lot of religious apathy and space, right? Physical space, resulted in an erosion of support for established churches, right? So you have your, what nowadays would be referred to as mainline churches, right? The religious mainline, the most established churches. So these would have been things like the Church of England, right? So the Anglicans who would have come into, with the British to North America, and then some other, there's like the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians that would have come over from Scotland, and a whole bunch of other churches, right? But without explicit regulation or establishment of a national faith, basically they didn't cater to the state, right? Church doesn't cater to the state. If you have, a national faith, sorry, this should be with explicit regulation. They basically cater to the state. Without it, they don't cater to the state. They cater to the people, right? They cater to the people who actually want to experience those, kind of religious ideas, religious experiences, right? So churches that are aligned with the state, right, because their funds, basically state funds, pay for everything, they align with the state. They do the state's dirty work, right? And we saw this through medieval Europe, right? Church and state were always deeply linked, and the kings had enormous sway over the church in lots of ways, and vice versa. But once you remove that, ultimately churches have to cater to people, right? So what Stark and Fink says, in America, it unleashed upstart sects and their preachers, right? So you have a lot of religious innovation. That traditional secularization model will say that for religious groups to survive, they ultimately have to become less and less spiritual, right? They have to become less and less supernatural. But what Stark and Fink say is that history contradicts this, right? So basically, like, secularization thesis is going to say, like, if religions are going to survive as scientific rationalism starts to take hold, they're going to abrogate a lot of the supernatural kind of beliefs, because that's going to be at odds with science, right? And with rationality. So they're going to become more like social service organizations. But what Stark and Fink ultimately say is that this is actually incorrect, right? To the extent that they actually do survive, it's the less secularized faiths that tend to have steep growth curves, right? It's the ones that lean into the religious elements that actually grow. Because, and this is kind of a straight up lesson from Stark, what people want from religion is religion, right? They don't want a social service program. They don't want any of those things. And Stark makes a very similar point in other places when he talks about Latin America. In the kind of early part or middle part of the 20th century, the Catholic Church facing a inflow of Protestants, who were coming and evangelizing in Latin America, created something called liberation theology, which is sort of like blending Catholicism with Marxism. And basically, it sort of turned the church into a social service organization. The idea being that poor people would flock to the church if it offered more services. What ended up happening was it worked a little bit, but ultimately the Protestants, who offered a more spiritual version of Christianity, grew and grew and grew to the point where, like, say in places like Guatemala, it's now about 50-50 Catholics and Protestants. Okay, but that's a different story. Okay, so yeah, you've got all of these established churches. So this is like contemporary America, right? And I'll talk about the chart in a second. So the collapse of what are called the mainline colonial churches, Stark says, was marked from 1776 to 1850, right? So back on that chart, right, where 17% were members, and it grows up into the 30s by 1850. Basically, what he says is a lot of those established churches were already going through collapse, right? So the Presbyterians and Episcopalians went from 55% of all church adherents in 1776 to 19% in 1850. And today, they only make up about 4%, right? Again, these were the big, you had the first wave of settlers in America were British and they were Scottish, right? You get Germans and other people later on. Presbyterian is Scottish. Anglican is, or Episcopalian, because once they split from England, they didn't want to be called Anglicans anymore because it was too English, so they started calling themselves Episcopalians, but they're still Anglicans at the end of the day. They basically collapsed, right? And they've been collapsing for a long time, according to Stark. The upstart faiths, principally Baptist and Methodist, came from their growth, right? And they do grow enormously, right? And so, like, if you look here, this is kind of more modern. This is, I don't remember what year this is. I want to say it's about 2018. The biggest church, like mainline church or older church in America by the early 2020s is the United Methodist Church, right? Because the Methodists came in the 19th century and basically beat the pants off of the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, and all of those folks. They outcompeted the older churches in New England. By 1850, there's more Methodists and Baptists in New England than Congregationalists. They also went out to the frontier and gathered people on the frontier more effectively than those older churches. Is that time right? Okay, it is. I never trust clocks after a time change because I never know. This one says 11:30. That one says 10:30. I'm never quite sure. Okay. Oh yeah, I added this in. This isn't Stark's argument. This comes from a guy named Ryan Burge, and you'll hear lots about him later when we do Religious Landscape because he's awesome. And I steal his things. Follow him on Twitter if you're interested in Source of Religion. At Ryan Burge. Subscribe to his Substack. It's not expensive, but you'll find out a lot. My live read ends here. Okay, so this is just like the last basically couple of decades, right? So between 1990 and 2021, just to show this kind of collapse of the mainline churches. So we'll exclude the United Methodist Church a little bit here, but basically you can see even now, right, Presbyterian Church of America and PCUSA, if they'd kept up with population growth, there would be 2 million Presbyterian Church of America, which is more conservative, PCUSA more liberal. There should be, I guess PCUSA is that. Oh, sorry, PCUSA is more conservative. PCA, Presbyterian Church of America, is more liberal, right? So there should have been 2 million if they kept with growth rates. There's about 1.2. PCUSA, the more conservative one, there's based on population growth, they should have been 2.9. They're 3.3. Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, if they just kept up with population growth, very liberal denomination of Lutherans. There should have been 7 million. There's only 3. I don't remember what that one is. The Episcopal Church, I think, or I can't actually remember what TC is. I want to say it's the Episcopal. I think it is. Episcopal Church? Yeah, I think that's right. Sorry, I got these wrong. I'm looking at the wrong ones. Assemblies of God. Sorry, I got these. I was reading wrong. Evangelical Lutheran Church, I did get right. ABC USA, I don't know. Can't remember. Sorry, PCA, very small. PCUSA also has shrunk. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. So they're all shrinking. SBC, which is Southern Baptist Contention, which is like the oldest Baptists, they're still shrinking and they've gone through a big contraction. United Methodists, absolute collapse, but we'll talk about them. They used to be like upstarts and now they're very establishment. Assemblies of God are kind of Pentecostal. They're the only ones that have kind of grown, more or less. Sorry, I read that chart wrong because I'm trying to do this fast. Okay. So how did the upstart churches do it? How did the Methodists and the Baptists supplant, the established churches? This is, I think, an interesting question, and it goes to this kind of market theory. So what Stark and Fink say, they responded to the needs of people without changing core beliefs, right? They're very fervently Christian in their early days, right? And very, very, we would call them conservative. You could call them orthodox. They changed form without changing belief, right? So, yeah, they were both quick to adapt to forms of revivalism and music that were popular in the 19th century, right? So, the equivalent today of like a church picking up like a pop kind of music sound or Christian rock of the 1990s was kind of what the Methodists and Baptists ultimately did, right? Whatever the popular music was and the genres of the day, they picked that up. And they picked up kind of forms of preaching, right? There were these kind of roving revivals. We talk about the Great Awakenings, right? They had these kind of roving preachers that would preach these very emotive sermons, right? In these very kind of direct terms. And they picked up that way of doing things because it seemed to resonate with people. This one I think is really interesting and important. Their clergy were typically recruited and trained in local congregations, right? So instead of having some person come from Princeton Theological Seminary or Harvard Divinity School or Yale Divinity School or some such place, right? Basically, they picked someone out of the congregation who seemed smart and with it, and that person became the pastor. They maybe trained them, but it was someone that was fundamentally very much like the congregation. So there's that where you can get sometimes a cultural disconnect, and Stark and Fink talk about this. And I mean, if you've ever been to a Catholic church, and heard sometimes what the priest is preaching, often it's in these like high kind of academic terms of theology. And it's like people don't really understand because they're not educated in that. That's what happened in, say, the mainline churches. But in these upstart churches, because they're trained locally, they're just kind of picking up the Bible, reading it, and interpreting it like a normal person. And that appeals to people because they can understand it. Okay. They demanded a lot from their members, right? Again, so Stark's whole ethos on, we saw it in the rise of Christianity. We see it again here. They rooted out free riders, right? If you were just along for the ride, you're going to find being a Methodist or a Baptist kind of unpleasant because they're going to ask you for a lot. They generated from that higher levels of commitment, more sources to the local church. I should put check marks. All the things that Stark think are good, and created distinct religious communities with close social ties. So you can bring people in, there's close social ties, their bonds are going to start outweighing the bonds outside, and they're going to join. Okay. So how did the Methodists do this, right? So, I mean, this is what, like a revival, right? This is actual kind of lithograph of a drawing that was reproduced of a revival, and this is kind of what it looks like, right? This guy is preaching. Blah, blah, blah. I don't know why I'm doodling on my slides today. I guess it works. And look at how like disorganized this looks, right? You got women dancing, people chatting on the sidelines. There's dogs over here, which I'm sure you wouldn't have been able to see if I hadn't circled them. There's tents over here, right? There's a camp, so people are camping as they're having their revival. This lady's down on her knees, probably praying, right? And it looks pretty chaotic, right? But a lot of times this is, I compare it to like Celebration Church, which I've never been to, but I've seen videos that's in like Argyle in 76, which I think is like a rock concert or mosh pit, basically. Okay. So, very disorganized looking, very different from what you might think church looks like, right? Shirt and tie, kind of stuffy person at the front preaching. Well, that did happen. There was a lot of this kind of stuff. And they adopted some of what made this appealing to people inside their congregations. Okay. So Methodist congregations, one of the things they did, they divided the congregation into small closeness groups of about 12 members called I believe it's called a cohort of a boot. Oops, typo. Of a boot. Classic Canadian way of saying it. I've only ever heard one Canadian actually say a boot, and it's the weirdest thing. Because I'm like, does anyone in Canada actually say a boot? JJ McAuliffe, who's a YouTuber, always says a boot, and I find it so odd. Anyway, not important. So yeah, each class kind of meets on a weekly basis. They try to kind of, they're meeting, they're talking about religious subjects, right? The zeal of these revivals by that is maintained. So you go from this, and then you have small groups that kind of maintain that zeal. You make friendships, right? Yeah, it's 12 people is a close-knit group. And so you're going to have really tight bonds with those people. Not kind of as an accident. The Mormons emerge kind of in a similar time, and the Mormons adopt some of this, right? These kind of close fellowships and small groups and people checking in on each other to make sure everything's going well religiously. The Mormons adopt this as well. And to this day, right, it still kind of lingers in Mormonism in some sense. So you still have this kind of checking in, right? And it's picked up from the Methodists at this kind of moment. Testimonials are offered, right? So people say what God's been doing in their life. All right, this one's really important. Converts are instructed, right? So people who come into the Methodist faith get put into one of these groups, and that group is charged with teaching them, right? So they are instructed on the faith and keep an eye on everybody. So if you're whoring, if you're drinking, you're getting in trouble with your group of 12 friends, right? If you fall back into whatever habits you had before, and again, it's the frontier, so there's all sorts of stuff. You're going to get pulled back in because they're going to come and they're going to put pressure on you. And if you don't comply, they're going to kick your ass out of there. Which means, right, there's a lot of social pressure and a lot of social control going on. Okay. Is religiosity still increasing according to more recent statistics? No. But we'll get to that. It takes a turn in the early 2000s. Arguably, okay, I'll say this. Arguably, it hits its kind of high point in about 1993. I know that's a very specific year, but it's about 1993. You get a real high point in religiosity, after which point we see decline start to set in. But, it's a more recent thing. Okay. How am I doing for time? I'm doing so good. Religion, but cheaper. So, the upstart churches, the clergy in a lot of cases, serve for little or no pay, right? Typically, if it's someone just from the congregation, right, they're working in the community, they're a blacksmith or they're working in the lumber camps or they run the general store or something. Being clergy isn't their principal occupation. So, stark contrast this with the expensive seminary-educated clergy of the mainline churches that want full-time employment as clergy. And things like, the dirty word, pensions. When they retire, right? They want a pension. They want to be able to retire. This is, a professional class. These are professional clergymen. And they're super expensive. And for a church to afford one is really expensive, right? Because suddenly you're providing for them, their family, their future, their pension, and they may not stick around because they might move back to, New York or wherever they're from. Okay, so this allows the upstart churches to operate at lower costs, and therefore more of their resources can go to supporting the community and recruiting new members, right? So more of that energy is focused outward than inward on just supporting the clergy. They're chosen from the congregation. So they're never lacking, right? And one of the things that happens, it happens in the Catholic Church, it happens in these established mainline churches, is at one point they sort of go through crises in the number of clergy that are available because the seminaries aren't cranking out enough graduates. Now, as much as they may be getting a professional salary, preacher is not that appealing of a job for most people. I see your question. Give me 2 seconds. Preacher is not that appealing of a job, right? It's not one of particularly high social status, and you're not going to get very wealthy doing it, even if you are supported. Yeah.
Can we apply like the idea of like primary conversion and versus secondary conversion sort of to the clergy? Whereas if they like had another job, then clergy was like a passion project, they were super into it. Whereas if it was more of a profession, they viewed it less
Like as a job?
Yeah.
Working 9 to 5. Probably. Sorry, I shouldn't sing. Yeah, I think so, right? It's much more for laughing at me. It's good. Yeah, I think so, right? They're much more passionate about it. It's something they're doing in their free time. It's something that they must really care about. I think what Stark is more interested in is the fact that they are members of those particular communities, and that means they're like everybody else. And especially that they speak in everyday language, right? They're not talking about highfalutin theological concepts, there's nobody talking about eschatology, or the deontological nature of Christian thought, right? None of that would creep in. I remember a Catholic priest starting talking about deontology in their sermon, and I was like, okay, I understand what you're talking about. I'm pretty sure that family over there just tuned out. Right, so professional clergy has this kind of problem. But yeah, I mean, if you're from the local community, you're supporting your church, you're probably more passionate about it. And it's easier to find people, right? Like, you're not having to write to Dear Princeton Theological Seminary. I don't know why I'm typing. There's no typewriters. Dear Princeton Theological Seminary, please send us one preacher. I hope he's good this time, and doesn't leave after 6 months living in our, community on the Ohio River at the edge of civilization, right? Okay. Yeah, so sermons by professional clergy were often, and I'm going to circle this, and still are, dense, boring, and lacking in emotional appeal. Right? And again, it goes back to what people care about when it comes to religion. Do they care about correct theology, or do they really just want to move, right? They really want to feel it. No. I can't do this in 2 minutes, because this is actually a lot. Okay, we'll pick up on building religious enclaves. We'll start here on Wednesday, and we'll finish up with this, and then we'll move into the religious landscape for one lecture before reading week. All right. Have a good one. Should I keep my doodles? I'm going to keep them. All right. Turn off the recording.